the year 1415, a man walked calmly toward his execution, singing hymns as his voice rose above the crackling fire that was about to consume him. Jan Hus, a Czech priest who had dared to confront the most dominant institution of his era, had been granted safe passage by an emperor and promised protection from the Holy Roman Empire itself. Yet as the flames devoured his body, those pledges were reduced to ash along with his flesh. His death did not extinguish his message. Instead, it sparked a movement that would unsettle the foundations of medieval Europe and continue to resonate into the present day. The early 1400s marked a period of immense turmoil within Christian Europe. The Catholic Church, long the undisputed spiritual authority, was entangled in scandal and internal conflict. The Great Schism had shattered the unity of the papacy, with several claimants simultaneously asserting themselves as the true pope. Corruption had infected every level of the church's structure, from local priests demanding fees for sacraments to high-ranking cardinals living in extravagance while the poor went hungry. The church had become bloated from selling indulgence, essentially, offering salvation to the wealthy, and many devout Christians began to question whether the institution still reflected the teachings of Christ. It was into this chaotic world that Jan Hus emerged, born around 1370, in the humble Bohemian village of Husinek, the son of peasants. Hus rose through the ranks via education and ordination, eventually earning a professorship at Charles University in Prague and serving as rector of the Bethlehem Chapel. But unlike many of his peers who sought comfort in ecclesiastical appointments, Hus grew increasingly troubled by what he saw. He observed priests barely able to pronounce Latin stumbling through Mass, bishops hoarding multiple church offices while neglecting their communities, and a papal court seemingly more preoccupied with political intrigue than with spiritual guidance. The contradiction between the Church's teachings on humility and poverty and its actual behavior marked by greed and manipulation became too glaring for him to overlook. Hus drew inspiration from the writings of John Wycliffe, an English theologian who had asserted that the Biblinot, the Pope should be the final authority on matters of faith. Though Wycliffe had been condemned as a heretic, his writings had spread rapidly across Europe, capturing the attention of those yearning for reform. Hus began delivering sermons in Czech instead of Latin, making his messages accessible to ordinary people who had long been excluded from understanding their faith. He preached that salvation came through personal faith and scripture, not by buying indulgences or obeying papal mandates. He insisted the church return to the poverty of the apostles, and argued that priests who lived in corruption forfeited their spiritual authority. His bold sermons attracted large audiences at the Bethlehem Chapel, drawing merchants, craftsmen, and nobility alike to hear his revolutionary message. But as his popularity grew, so did the risks. The local archbishop and clergy, alarmed by Hus's rising influence and defiance of their control, began exerting pressure to silence his preaching. When Hus refused to comply, the church authorities escalated the matter to Pope John XXIII, of three rival claimants to the papal throne during the Great Schism. He issued a formal papal decree barring Hus from preaching. Nonetheless, Hus remained defiant, insisting that he must obey God rather than corrupt men, even if they wore the robes of the papacy. Tensions intensified when Hus publicly denounced the Pope's sale of indulgences used to finance a crusade against his papal adversaries. This was more than a theological argument, it was a direct assault on the Church's economic and political foundations. Hus was excommunicated, and Prague was placed under interdict, effectively banning all religious services in the city while he remained. To avoid bringing further hardship on his followers, Hus voluntarily left Prague. For the next 2 years, he traveled the Bohemian countryside, preaching and writing. Far from fading into obscurity, his message gained traction, especially among commoners who saw in him a voice for moral and spiritual reform. The turning point came in 1414, with the convening of the Council of Constance, which was tasked with resolving the papal schism and restoring order to the Church. Emperor Sigismund of the Holy Roman Empire, determined to heal the divisions plaguing his realm, extended a personal invitation to Hus to appear before the council and defend his teachings. Most importantly, he issued a letter of safe conduct, assuring Hus protection from arrest or harm throughout his travels and during his stay in Constance. This guarantee was no empty gesture. Such letters were regarded as solemn commitments, binding the honor of the issuing authority. For an emperor to break such a vow would mean irreparable damage to his reputation and undermine the delicate fabric of diplomatic trust in medieval Europe. Hus was cautious, aware of the potential danger. His friends pleaded with him not to go, fearing betrayal. Yet Hus felt morally bound to uphold his beliefs. He was confident that reason and scripture would prevail, and that the emperor's word would be honored. On the 11th of October, 1414, Hus departed for Constance, escorted by Bohemian nobles and bearing Sigismund's assurance of protection. It would be the last time he saw his homeland. His faith in imperial integrity would prove to be a tragic misjudgment with fatal consequences. Hus arrived in Constance on the 3rd of November, 1414, and at first moved about the city freely. He preached in private homes and met with allies. Encouraged by the apparent goodwill, he sent hopeful letters back to Prague, describing a warm reception. But it soon became apparent that the council had no intention of engaging in open theological debate. Instead, they had convened a tribunal barely 3 weeks after his arrival. On the 28th of November, Hus was seized by order of the cardinals and Pope John XXIII, flagrantly violating the emperor's promise of safe passage. When Emperor Sigismund objected to this blatant breach of his promise, the council dismissed his protests, asserting that oaths made to heretics held no validity, and that the authority of the Church transcended imperial guarantees. Stripped of imperial protection, Hus was confined to a Dominican monastery under appalling conditions. His cell was scarcely large enough to lie down in, and was situated beside a latrine that flooded the cramped space with toxic stench. The overpowering smell made him physically ill, yet his jailers showed no compassion. For months, he was deprived of adequate nutrition, proper medical attention, and even the most basic hygiene. Although his body weakened quickly under these harsh circumstances, his resolve never wavered. He spent his days in prayer and composing letters to his supporters, urging them to remain steadfast in the truth of the gospel, regardless of what might happen to him. The trial that followed was anything but fair. It was a foregone conclusion, designed to disgrace him, rather than genuinely evaluate his teachings. Hus was confronted with a list of accusations supposedly drawn from his sermons and writings. Though many had been twisted beyond recognition, or completely misrepresented. When he tried to clarify his true beliefs or cite scripture in his defense, he was drowned out by antagonistic bishops and cardinals who had no interest in sincere theological discussion. The proceedings were conducted entirely in Latin, making it nearly impossible for any of Hus's Czech supporters in attendance to follow. And he was constantly interrupted, preventing him from mounting a meaningful defense. The council demanded a full retraction of his views and complete submission to papal authority. They offered to spare his life, sentencing him instead to lifelong imprisonment, if only he would confess error and beg forgiveness. But Hus stood firm. He refused to renounce his conscience or deny the truth he saw in the Bible. "I would not, for a chapel full of gold, abandon the truth," he declared. He insisted that he could not disavow beliefs he never held, nor deny scripture merely to preserve his earthly life. His unwavering stance, even when faced with death, both infuriated and baffled the council, who had assumed he would collapse under the weight of their pressure. As the trial stretched on through the winter and into the spring of 1415, unrest grew in Bohemia. Petitions, signed by hundreds of nobles, poured into the council demanding Hus's release and warning of retaliation if he were harmed. But these threats only hardened the council's resolve. They realized that sending Hus back alive, even muzzled, would embolden his movement and set a precedent for future reformers to defy the church without consequence. On the 6th of July, 1415, the final session of his trial commenced at the Cathedral of Constance, attended by cardinals, bishops, abbots, and civil dignitaries. One final opportunity was extended to recant fully, and his life would be spared. Hus stood to address the gathering, his frame frail from months of captivity, but his voice remained firm and unwavering. With clarity and resolve, he affirmed that he had always endeavored to preach only what aligned with Scripture. He insisted that it had never been his aim to sow discord within the church, and that he could not, in good faith, disavow teachings he believed to be true. "God is my witness," he declared, "that I have never taught or preached what these false accusers claim." When it became undeniable that Hus would not renounce his beliefs, the council formally declared him a heretic and turned him over to secular officials for execution. Following the established ritual of degradation, they stripped him of his priestly garments one by one while publicly reading his condemnation. A paper crown adorned with demonic figures and marked with the word heretic was placed on his head. Yet throughout the spectacle, Hus maintained his composure, praying softly and displaying neither fear nor remorse. Emperor Sigismund, who had given his word to protect Hus, witnessed the entire proceeding in silence, choosing not to act. Hus was led immediately to a field beyond the city walls, where a stake and pyre had been readied. Thousands had assembled to witness the execution, including numerous council officials eager to see the punishment fulfilled. The executioner offered Hus one final chance to save his life by recanting his views, but he refused. "Today, you are roasting a goose," he said, playing on the meaning of his name in Czech. "But 100 years from now, a swan will rise whose song you will not be able to silence." The words would prove eerily prophetic, as precisely 102 years later, Martin Luther would spark the Protestant Reformation, ending the Catholic Church's uncontested dominance over Western Christianity. As the flames were kindled, Hus began to sing hymns in Latin, his voice echoing clearly across the open field. "Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me," he sang. Even as the fire consumed his garments and flesh, eyewitnesses claimed he continued to sing until the smoke and heat became overwhelming. Some even said his lips continued to move in prayer long after his voice had faded. The pyre burned for hours until only ashes remained. These were cast into the river Rhine to prevent any chance of his followers retrieving relics. Word of Hus's execution reached Bohemia within days and incited immediate fury. The nobility felt deceived by Sigismund's betrayal of his pledge, while ordinary citizens regarded Hus as a martyr who had perished for proclaiming the plain truth of the gospel. Uprisings broke out across Bohemia, and many churches began conducting services according to Hus's principles rather than those mandated by the Pope. When church authorities attempted to install a loyalist to replace Hus at the Bethlehem Chapel, the congregation rose in protest and forcibly expelled the new appointee. The fury that swept through Bohemia quickly escalated into a full-scale rebellion against both ecclesiastical and imperial control. What followed were the Hussite Wars, a brutal conflict that raged for the next 20 years, during which Czech forces repeatedly triumphed over crusading armies, dispatched by both the Pope and the Emperor. These wars were among the earliest in Europe to be driven chiefly by religious convictions rather than territorial ambitions or dynastic rivalries. The Hussites introduced groundbreaking tactics, including the strategic use of war wagons and early forms of gunpowder weaponry innovations that would leave a lasting imprint on the nature of European warfare. Their victories sent a clear message: papal supremacy could be resisted and defeated by force of arms. This emboldened reform movements across the continent, offering hope to those who also questioned the moral and spiritual legitimacy of the Church's authority. Jan Hus's execution became far more than a national tragedy. It transformed into a unifying symbol for Czech independence and a catalyst for religious reform across Europe. His writings, which were smuggled out of prison and circulated widely, inspired figures from England to Hungary. The invention of the printing press, shortly after his death, enabled his ideas to travel faster and more broadly than ever before. When Martin Luther launched his challenge to Catholic authority in 1517, he openly credited Hus and other early reformers who had paid the ultimate price for their beliefs. The betrayal of Hus's safe conduct had far-reaching consequences for medieval political culture. Emperor Sigismund's failure to uphold his promise stained his reputation throughout the Holy Roman Empire and helped sow the seeds of political fragmentation that would trouble Central Europe for centuries. The notion that agreements with heretics were not binding undermined the entire framework of diplomatic protections and safe passage that had supported negotiations throughout the Middle Ages. Reformers would never again place their trust in papal or imperial assurances, having seen how readily such sacred promises could be broken. The Church's handling of Hus also established a grim precedent tone of silencing dissent not through dialogue, but through coercion and violence. Instead of confronting the legitimate grievances raised by Hus and others' grievances centered on corruption, greed, and hypocrisy, Church authorities responded with threats, imprisonment, and execution. This only deepened the perception that the institution had strayed from its spiritual mission and was now more concerned with preserving its worldly influence and wealth. Today, Jan Hus is recognized by historians as a key transitional figure between the medieval and modern eras. His commitment to biblical authority over papal edict, his insistence on preaching in the language of the people, and his condemnation of ecclesiastical corruption all anticipated the core themes of the Protestant Reformation. His courage refusing to recant even when faced with death continues to inspire those who stand against religious oppression and moral compromise. Oxford historian Diarmaid MacCulloch has called Hus the first martyr of Protestantism, while Czech scholars celebrate him as both a spiritual reformer and a patriotic defender of Czech identity. In the face of German imperial dominance, his story reveals the peril faced by those who challenge entrenched power, armed only with conviction and truth. His reliance on imperial assurances and his belief in reasoned theological debate ultimately proved misplaced in the face of institutions willing to use any tactic to preserve their dominance. Yet in death, Hus achieved what he could not in life. His martyrdom laid bare the ethical decay of his persecutors and ignited a movement that would eventually realize many of the reforms he had championed. Even today, in an era where religious and political leaders still claim divine legitimacy for their actions, Hus's legacy serves as a powerful reminder. At times, the demands of conscience require defiance in the face of corrupt power. Matter, the personal sacrifice. The fire that consumed Jan Hus in 1415 sparked a blaze of reform that the Catholic Church would never fully suppress. His death elevated him from a rebellious cleric to a symbol of enduring resistance, whose story would empower generations of reformers. The broken promise of safe passage became emblematic of how authority, when unchecked, can twist even the most sacred vows for its own ends. 6 centuries on, his story still asks us the hard questions. What commitments are being betrayed in our time? And which truths must we stand for, regardless of the cost?